Hi everybody, it's Miss Beth from Vandegrift Library. Today we're going to start off with our Family History Fridays, and today we'll be discussing the very beginning steps you would make if you wanted to pursue your family history. This is not, I don't have any certifications or anything in this. It's just my hobby. I've been doing it a very long time, and I hope that I can pass on some of the knowledge to you and maybe get you bitten by the genealogy bug, so to speak. As you probably know, family history is also called, the subject is called genealogy, and it covers the history of your family back as far as you can possibly get it. Some people can go back into like the 600s or 700s. It depends on how prominent your family was in olden days, and also how many records there are that you can find and attach, trace to your family that prove that you belong in those lines. So anyway, I'll show you the way I learned when I learned a long time ago. The first thing that you want to do is write down what you know. Now, if you want, you can just get a notebook and just start keeping notes in that. One really good way to organize your information when you first start out is this. It's called an ancestor chart. And it gives you kind of a structure so you can see who's who and where they fit. I have one partly filled out here to show you too, using my family. So person number 1 is me. Person number 2 is my father. Person number 3 is my mother. Also on this, if you follow across, everything on the upper half is related to my father's family, and on the lower half is related to my mother's family. So if we go to the next generation, my grandparents, this is my grandfather on my dad's side and my grandmother on my dad's side. Likewise, here is my grandfather on my mother's side and my grandfather on my mother and my grandmother on my mother's side. Excuse me. Now, the next row is all my great-grandparents on both sides. So these 4 are my dad's side, and these ones at the bottom are my mother's side. And then I have my great-great-grandparents. Now you'll notice this isn't entirely filled out. I do have dates for back pretty far, but I haven't put them all in because maybe when you start out on yours, you're not going to have dates. You're only going to have names, because that's how I started with a lot of mine. I had no dates. I only had names on some of my lines. And if you don't even have names, that's okay too. I do recommend doing this form in pencil if you're going to use it as a working form, because you may write information in, or dates or places where people came from or were born, and you won't know until later. You'll doing research, you'll find out you had some information that wasn't quite correct, and if you have a pencil, you can erase it and put the correct information in. I had one branch of my family that was, I had it way back into the 1500s, and it turns out it was the wrong wife that had my ancestor. The first wife had my ancestor and then passed away. So there was a whole lot of research there that was no longer valid, but these things happen. If you don't have a form, or you don't want to, you can download these on the internet. Just search free ancestor form or free ancestry chart, free pedigree chart, and you should be able to find a downloadable form. Or you can just kind of make your own by drawing it on a piece of paper. You can do it this way or the way the written one is done, and start with yourself, then do your mother and your father, and then their parents, and so on and so on. It's just important that you have some record of what you already know and what you've already found out, so you don't duplicate your research, and also so that you know where you need to look and what information you are missing. Now, let's talk about info you can find at your house or without going out, especially under the current circumstances. That's probably the best thing to do till we hear more. Things you can find at your house would be family Bibles. Most often, especially older family Bibles, will have a wealth of information with births, deaths, marriages, children born to the marriages. Sometimes they go back. If you have a very old family Bible in your family, the person who owns it may be very hesitant to like let you borrow it and go have copies made of it or something like that. In that case, you could maybe approach them about coming to their house to view the Bible and take digital photographs of it with your camera or your cell phone, so that you had have a record without destroying the Bible or having it go away from their house or out of their control, even momentarily, because a Bible like that is a very precious treasure. And I understand why somebody wouldn't want to just let some random person they don't really know take it off someplace to get it copied or do something with it and maybe never get it back. Sometimes there are no family Bibles because things happen. You know, Uncle John's second wife, after he died, she got rid of all his stuff, and the Bible was part of all his stuff, and nobody knows where it is now. Maybe it got burnt in the burn pile. Maybe it got sent to the Salvation Army store. Who knows? That happens. That happened in my family. Military records. If somebody in your family, parent, grandparent, aunts, uncles, was in the military, they probably have military documents relating to when they were drafted or joined the service, when they were discharged. If they served overseas, there's records. There could be pension records. If you're back pretty far, like into the Civil War, there's pension records for that. You can request these records from the archives in Washington, D.C. Some of them are online, but we'll be talking more about the online options later on in this series. Another thing that's really helpful sometimes is old pictures. If you have a box of old pictures at your house with no ID on them, because, you know, in generations past, it was like, oh, everybody knows who that is. Well, nowadays we have a box full of pictures and nobody knows who they are. So if you have older relatives, aunts, great aunts, grandparents, bring the box of pictures to their house someday and sit down and go through them and say, you know, look, do you know who this is? Does anybody know who this person is? A lot of times they still know who those people are. And they can tell you the event that it happened, what the occasion was, that all these people were in their best clothes and the house was decorated and everything. And they'll know those things and who those people are and how they were related. And that in itself is quite a prize, because then you not only know who the people are and how they fit into your family tree, but you have a picture of them that you could attach to it at some time in the future if you want to go that deeply into your family tree. Another thing, like in my case, my grandmother, my mother's mother, her address books were a treasure of information, because she would write the person's name and their address and say, this is my cousin on the Smith side. And so you'd know where to look, like how everybody was related to her. This is my great aunt. This is my aunt. This is Bessie's sister's mother. You know, she got very detailed with her address book. So it was kind of like a little family tree record all on its own. And when she passed away, of course, my mother received that book. And then when I started working on the family tree, my mother gave it to me. And it was very helpful with my grandmother's side of the family, because she had recorded how everybody was related. This is my second cousin. Their dad is so-and-so. It was very helpful. Another thing that could be very useful are old scrapbooks. If anybody in your family kept one, there might be birth announcements in there, wedding announcements, obituaries for family members who passed away, articles concerning perhaps somebody in your family was a city councilman or ran a business or such things, that there would be information in there regarding, you know, things that they did during their tenure serving the community, or ads for their business, or other ways that you could connect to the family and have some interesting little documentation of their life and times in earlier days. But your biggest resource you're going to have when you first start doing your family tree is, not surprisingly, your family, because you got to start with what you know. So if you were filling out your genealogy form like this, you would put your name here where it says Miss Beth. That would be your name. Well, you know when you were born probably and where you were born and such, and you could easily fill that in. Then you probably know your parents' names too. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when you're recording women in your family tree, my grandmother's here, okay? You see here, this is my grandfather. My grandmother is recorded by her maiden name. Always record the women by their maiden name. Marriage is assumed. You don't need to put both names, but their maiden name's important in order to be able to track their family back through the generations, because their family is coming from the maiden name, not their married name. I hope I made that clear. So once you have your parents' information down, then you start with, if your grandparents are still, you still have your grandparents that are living, definitely I would say talk to them, call them on the phone. They'd love to hear from you, I'm sure. And see if you can get them talking about their younger days and who they hung out with, their cousins maybe that they did things with, their brothers and sisters, how they grew up, where they lived. You know, did they have a horse and a cart to go to town in, or did they have to walk? When did they get their first car? If they're comfortable with it, I definitely recommend recording, because then you are definitely sure you have the information exactly as they told you. Some people are not, so in that case, I would say take notes, especially watch the dates, because dates are very important in genealogy research. Sometimes you'll have families that are distantly related, but they're in the same area around the same time frame, and those dates can make a difference between getting the right person connected to your family and having the wrong person connected to your family. Another person who never think that someone who is not closely related to you is not a good resource. Sometimes somebody who's like a second or third cousin who is quite elderly could be very, very helpful to you. I had a cousin who was that way, and I can't even begin to thank her for all the information she was able to give me. So those are definitely ways that you want to go in and look at different people. Call your aunts, your uncles, your great aunts or uncles if you have those. Also, those are people that might have access to other documents that your family doesn't have, maybe old letters or something. If you had a relative who served in, say, the World War II or World War I or even the Civil War, maybe one of the other relatives in your family has letters and they would let you copy them or send you copies of them so you could read these letters that were sent home from the front during whatever conflict was going on at the time, and it would give you an insight into the feelings that your parents, grandparents, great uncles and aunts had at the time, which, you know, it does show through the years. You'll see that pretty much people are all the same. They all love their kids, they love their spouse or not, and it's not so different from now feelings wise and the way that people reacted to different things. I mean, things are different, of course. We have cars and we don't have horses and such, but some things stay the same throughout the years, even generations and generations back. It was still heartbreaking to lose a child in infancy, and it was still very sad and very hard if a spouse died young, especially if it was the man. And you know, the normal kind of interactions with people in a family, that's been going on the same since the days of Jesus. So some things will always be the same, some things are different. Perils and pitfalls of doing your genealogy well. This is a big subject. There's always the possibility that you have gotten wrong information, either deliberately or by accident. Sometimes it's, I would say, not bad research, but maybe hasty research on your part. You accidentally connect someone to your family that shouldn't be, or you connect your family to someone who is not the correct person. This happened to me. I had one gentleman, William T. Burns, that I thought was my great-great-grandfather, and it turns out I had the wrong William T. Burns. There was two of them, and the one, they both grew up in, say, maybe a 25 square mile area of each other in the same general area. The one that was not mine was born a year later and died a year earlier. And for years, I had that wrong information on my tree. And then one time I got a note from a man, and he said, I think you have the wrong William T. Burns connected to your family, because he's my great-grandfather. And these are his known children, and none of these names match the ones that you have. So I was very happy to hear that, because you will make mistakes, guaranteed. And I called, I said, you know, I wrote him back and I said, I will check into this and thank you for letting me know. So I went and looked into the information, And yes, he was absolutely right. I had connected the wrong William T. Burns to my family. I had his great-grandfather as my third great-grandfather. So it was like, no, 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 no. So I unconnected him from my family. And then I put the other William Burns in. And so that started a whole new line of research, which sometimes you have to go back over what you've already done because it's important to get it right. So future people who are looking at your family tree are not confused. Unfortunately, before I found out my mistake, a lot of other people copied my tree. So now they have all this bad information in their tree too. I have attempted to contact everyone who I know copied my tree and let them know. Some of them were glad to know that, you know, there was a mistake and it could be fixed, and other ones never responded. So I don't know what they're doing with their problem. Another thing you'll run into is information that's only kind of wrong. Like I had someone who, like, perhaps they'll say, well, you know, the family came over from Germany on the Kaiser Wilhelm in 1895. And you start researching and you find out that that's not quite right, that they came from not Germany, but Holland. And it wasn't in 1895, it was in 1896. But they did get the ship right. And, you know, there's all kind of little variables like that could change. Or another problem that you could have is in Eastern Europe and in even like Germany, Poland, that area, the borders of the countries changed very often due to wars and territorial changes and whatnot. So you'll have somebody who comes over and it says on their immigration form that they came from Prussia. But if you look on the census, it says they're born in Germany, or it says they came from Austria or Hungary, and then it says they came from Czechoslovakia or Russia. And because these countries' borders were so fluid for so long, sometimes it's very confusing. And so you're going, where are these people from really? And what happened was not that they moved, but the borders changed so that the country became a different country. This also happened early in Pennsylvania, when before all the counties were set. You might have somebody who in the one census is listed in Bedford County. In the next census, they're listed in Westmoreland County. And the next census, they're listed in Armstrong County. But they've never moved. They've stayed the same place all the time. But the counties have been changed over the years. So that's something else you have to watch for. Another thing is name variations. Because chances are, whatever name your family started out with is not the one that you use now. There's most names, there are some that don't, but most names go through changes throughout the years. Until the Civil War, it was not common for a name, like a common spelling of a name. People spelled it how it sounded. So you could get all kind of different spellings. And even now when you're doing research, if you're using indexed records that someone else indexed, if they're not familiar with the names from the area that you're in, you might get God knows what kind of a name out of because things that are handwritten in cursive sometimes are very hard to read, and older documents, and like say one's written in sort of German, have different letter patterns even than we use now. So those are all things that you really need to look out for and keep an eye on, that, you know, these things could happen just because say your name's Schaefer and this person's name is spelled S-H-E-A-F-F-E-R and you spell your name S-H-A-F-E-R, doesn't mean they're two separate families. They could easily be the same family. Also watch for shortenings of names, where if you have a longer name, say Buccigrossi, and then it has been shortened to Bucci, B-U-C-C-I, and they just like left off the back half of it. Or say you have somebody named Zimmerman that's German, but they changed it to Painter, which is the Americanization, or what the American name means. I have an ancestor called Barbara Breitschwag, which means broadsword. So in some records it's the German name, in some records it's the American version of it, like the translation. So those are all things that you need to watch out for. And then you have the people that, for whatever reason, just changed it to something entirely different. My cousin's father was born in Poland, and right now I can't even think of what his birth name was, but when they moved here, his father changed the family name to Burns because it was easy and it sounded American, and they wanted to be Americans. So there's all kinds of things you have to watch out for with name changes, and sometimes you can go by other family members, which is another thing to consider when you're doing your genealogy. Is, do you want to do what I call straight line genealogy, or which is, you know, your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and on back as many generations as you can get it, or do you want to do what I call inclusive genealogy, which is not only your parents but their brothers and sisters, and your grandparents and their brothers and sisters, and you know, so that you have, rather than a straight tall tree with a few branches, you have like a giant shrub, which I have a giant shrub of a tree because I do the brothers and sisters and the children and everything. Sometimes that will lead you to some really good information if you're pursuing your line and you get stuck. I got stuck on my Scott line when they had come from Ireland. I was reading through an old county history book, and I came upon one of my ancestors' sisters, and I said, well, I'll look at this because it's his sister. Maybe that'll say something that'll be helpful to me. And definitely that was the case, because she had married a rather prominent man, and so there was not only a lot of information, but an actual drawing of her. And the information in her little biography in this book actually contained when the family came from Ireland, which was 1820. The father and the oldest son came, and they were here and established a farm. And about 5 years later, the son went back to Ireland, got the mom and the rest of the kids, and brought them over. And the rest of them, they all lived in Armstrong County for generations. We're still in Armstrong County, a lot of us. So you never know, that little side trip you take looking for information, sometimes it's not on your direct line. It's a brother or a sister of somebody that is your direct line. The good things about doing your family history is it's very fulfilling, finding out what your background's like, where your people came from, and how they settled the land. You know, if they're here, like early Pennsylvania settlers, and they had to carve their farm out of the woods, and it was such hard and exhausting work, but they still made a place and made a family and made a name, and, you know, helped develop the United States as we know it today. I had a 94-year-old cousin that I met when she was 94 years old, who actually knew my fourth great grandmother. So she was invaluable to me in my research, having known my fourth great grandmother, who was born in 1850, mind you, and died in 1942. So this woman stayed with the great great grandmother in summertime. Like, she would stay at her house over the summer, and so she had all kinds of stories about this woman that I would never have had any access to, because everybody else who had ever known her personally was dead except for this one cousin. So it greatly enriched my life to meet her and talk with her and correspond with her. And we were able to share stories back and forth. And she was one of the cases where she had information on the immigration that was right, but not quite right. The dates were a little bit off. Who came was a little bit off. But she had the little kernel there that got me started in the right direction on that family, for which I am eternally grateful. Sometimes, too, maybe one of your family members, my grandmother asked me to look into her birth family, her family that, her mother's family, because her mother died when she was only 11 years old. So she didn't know a lot about her mom's family. So I started researching that branch of the family for my grandmother, and she was always delighted whenever I would find any new information, and I would bring it to her so we could go over it and show her, you know, this is who their parents were and their parents were, and it goes back to Germany. And she was so excited to know so much more about her family. And that made us draw closer also, because we had that special time sharing family history information. And she shared a lot of stories about her childhood with me then that maybe I also wouldn't have heard. Another great thing about genealogy is you start doing your research and you realize, wow, I'm related to a lot of people around here. So it turns out that on two different sides, of both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side, I am actually distantly related to at least 4 people that are also my cousins. But at the time we became friends, we didn't know we were related. It just worked out that way. But it kind of makes sense because if you have kind of things in common because you're actually related, that you would be friends that way. So these are just a few of the things that I find rewarding about doing genealogy. Also, you can help other people once you know your way around the ropes, so to speak. You can help other people maybe find information they don't have on their background. And it's just, I find it very rewarding and fun, and it's kind of like reading a mystery book because you never know what you're going to find, because, you know, there's always a chance there's somebody with a scandal, that there are somebody who was arrested, somebody who ran off and abandoned a family, illegitimate children, divorce. Back in the day, that was a terrible scandal, but it happened. It did happen. You know, people were still people even 100, 200 years ago. So you have to, don't be surprised if you find a skeleton in the closet or two, because it's bound to happen. Most families have at least one. And, you know, there's also maybe medical issues. You can actually also track medical issues in your family history if you feel like doing that. If you keep track of the cause of death in cases where it's a genetic disorder, you can be able to tell your doctor, in case you would have a problem that would come up later, that you have you know, a medical history, that you know that your grandparents died of this and this, and that your great-grandparents died of this and this. So maybe you could track like a cancer or another genetic type disease throughout your family history and know if you are at higher risk and maybe should be tested. So I hope I've done a little bit towards expanding your knowledge of basic genealogy for today. Next week we'll be talking a little bit further about we'll do a family group sheet, which is a specific family's record. And also we'll discuss other records you could find, not online, other places you can find records that aren't necessarily online, and in a lot of cases are not online at all, or you have to pay for them. And sometimes it's a ridiculous amount of money. So until next week, I'll sign off and say goodbye and enjoy finding your ancestors. Thank you.